Please welcome with me our panelists, and let's start with the questions. So, Paula, if you don't mind, we will start with you. So, our question to you is: how has the history of gendered colonial violence in Palestine from the Mandate period shaped the international positioning of the Palestinian feminist and the international feminist movement and its shortcomings?
Right. Thank you so much, Aysel, for this question, because it allows us to think about the historical context of Palestine and its ongoing struggle for self-determination. There is, in fact, no way of understanding what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank and Palestine today without tackling the broader context of Palestinian history and its long denial of self-determination. So, the interplay of gender colonialism and feminism since Mandate Palestine and in the long Palestinian history of the 20th century is obviously a very complex history, but focusing us in the Mandate, I hope, will allow us to understand how the international legal system has contributed to shape Palestinian feminism and as well to shape the international feminist movement. So, to begin, let's briefly contextualize what is the Mandate Palestine. Was the Mandate period. Palestine was placed under the British colonial supervision following World War I and was part of the League of Nations Mandate system. The Mandate system was a system of international supervision designed to manage those territories which, as a consequence of World War I, had ceased to be under the sovereignty of Germany and the Ottoman Empire, the states that formerly governed them. And these territories, Palestine included, were considered, however, inhabited by people not yet able to stand by themselves. I'm quoting the League of Nations Covenant here, not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous condition of the modern world, so that their well-being and development formed a sacred trust of civilization. So in practice, how does it work? As Anthony Engie and other international legal historians has shown, the Mandate system worked has served as a bridge in the longer history of colonialism and international law, acting as a trade union between earlier forms of colonial domination and later form of colonial power, which will come into play particularly after World War II through developmental practices. So this historical backdrop set us the stage for understanding gender and feminism in Mandate Palestine, because it puts into the radar three different actors: the British colonial mandatory power, but also the League of Nations, which was entitled in checking supervising the application of the mandate. So the League of Nations, the same period during the interwar period, was also a significant platform for international feminist activism. Feminists sought access to this first international institution, the League, and successfully forging legal agendas that were implemented and adopted by the League. And in certain cases, they succeed in a way that by the time has to be considered certainly not a small achievement. And Palestinian feminists in this picture attempted to engage at the international level, both through the League of Nations, through petitioning the League of Nations and the Permanent Mandate Commission, which was the specific organ that had to supervise the mandates, and as well in international feminist conferences. The Arab Women Association was founded officially in 1929, although women were active since before, and was particularly active Collective being the most active petitioner to the Permanent Mandate Commission in comparison to any other groups from the mandate territories. And their petition tackled different issues, focusing on education, economic subalternity, issues of taxation, already prisoners' rights under the British colonial authorities, public services, and female domestic labor. But there was a important conundrum that was very early on highlighted by Palestinian women, in particular by Wadia Kartabel, which was on the question of women's rights. How can Palestinian women really ask for women's rights when men did not have any? Which posed the question of collective self-determination and who is part of the collective, and how to frame the competing interests of both individual and collective self-determination. Despite their active participation in the international arena, Palestinian women were significantly ignored by the Permanent Mandate Commission, which didn't or barely engaged with their petition. And also at the international feminist advocacy level, they faced similar challenges as well. When they participate, the international feminist movements at the time were largely dominated by Western and white feminists. And even when Palestinian groups managed to participate in international conferences, such as those sponsored by the International Alliance for Women's Suffrage and Citizenship or the International League for Peace and Freedom, and this is shown by the unsurpassed work of Leila Roop on this topic. The Palestinian women's perspective was still dismissed, and this became very highly visible between 1935 and 1939, when Western feminism become to be really concerned with the rise of authoritarianism and fascism in Europe, and issued several calls for international feminist solidarity, urging feminists around the world to build a united front between the women from the East and the West. And so this sort of opportunistic emphasis on universalizing notion of women's rights shows really the beginning, the myopia and the blindness on the realities and the challenge faced by feminist group in colonized under condition of colonialism. So I'll delve a bit deeper into a particular historical anecdote. I know we don't have too much time, but I think it's a bit of an anecdote that allow us to reflect on, with a bit of more details on the way in which the so-called color line really operates in international law. And by the color line, which is the title of this seminar, I mean how racial differences have been created, shaped, and used to justify exclusion and discrimination and inequality, particularly between the global North and the global South. And this anecdote starts from a legal issue, which was the legal issue of nationality rights at the League of Nations, and which was part of the broader struggle for women equal legal status, which at the time encompassed a various, whole plethora of issues in terms of personal laws and family laws. But the League of Nations, under the influence of feminist group, tackled the issue of nationality rights for women, which at the time followed the nationality of the husband, so it was a particular feminist concern, very seriously. And for example, allowing the Assembly of the League of Nations to be briefed by a Women's Consultative Committee on Nationality, which was composed of 8 international organizations. These 8 international organizations was mostly based on the West, but they had a most important role, which is to provide information to the League Assembly on how to regulate the issue. Now, in addition, exactly to feminists emanating in the global North, the most probably known of them are Alice Paul from the US or Margaret Corbett Ashby from the UK. two representatives of Global South country sat on the Nationality Committee, and these were Roosevelt Strauss representing Palestine and May Young representing the All Asian Conference of Women from India. Now, the representation of Palestine through the Jewish feminist already shows how Arab women's organization had much more limited international recognition compared to Jewish women organization in the international arena, which Jewish organization had much more integrated in Western feminist networks since they were predominantly based in the West and had easy access to the structures of the League. In fact, for example, Roosevelt Strauss, in addition to be the member of the League of Women's Consultative Committee on Nationality, was also the leader of the Union of Hebrew Women, which worked exclusively for Jewish women in Palestine, endorsing an exclusionary form of colonial superiority justified in racial terms. So while Palestinians women's group demands and as incorporated in the petition and their transnational networks emerging from the Global South, articulated women's concern mostly as connected with the land and with question of economic justice, highlighting the perils of industrialization and framing the collective struggle for self-determination. Western and white feminists based at the League often articulated feminist activism more in terms of voting rights and legislation on nationality regulated differently along racial lines, emphasizing how modern and civilized legislation often applied only to white subjects in the colonies. And so the League of Nations reinforced this dynamic, framing women's issue in Palestine through individual rights and economic development rather than addressing the anti-colonial and collective concern raised by Palestinian women petition. So what I'm pointing at in giving this sort of like historical glimpse and anecdote is how Western white privilege access to site of lawmaking in the first international institution must be factored in to understand the power imbalances in the creation of an international so-called human rights framework. In fact, this came to be has this become a sort of ensemble of legal technologies that were crafted in the metropole and then tested and ameliorated to their application in the colony. But their whole process was extremely exclusionary. And so in contrast, Palestinian women and other feminists from the Global South mobilized a time to oppose this process of universalizing women's rights, and at the same time they were marginalized, and this marginalization continues in the way in which we often tell the history of both international law and both the history of women's rights. So to come back to the question on how or what is the legacy of the mandate period, or how the mandate history of Palestine shaped the feminist movement and its international positioning, I believe the legacy of the mandate Palestine continues until today, and one obviously is the obvious roots or the obvious colonial roots of the question of Palestine today, but one is also a question of gender and feminist history. In fact, seems to be this paradox, still continue to exist, this paradoxical relationship between Israel's today feminist achievements and success stories in terms of women's rights, which keep based in a long history of silencing and displacement and erasure of Palestinian lives and experiences. And so in this sense, this legacy raises important question on the cooptation of feminist discourses by international governance as a way to keep justifying continuous oppressive and genocidal now practices.
Thank you, Paula. To be honest, it was very interesting because you pointed at certain things that I have never thought about. So thank you a lot. Christine, can we move on to you? So question to you is, from an international law perspective, how can we unpack the gendered aspects of today's genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and what are the legal frameworks and its limitations in addressing these issues?
Thank you, Aito and Paula, for the invitation and for organising this wonderful series. So I want to take us to the current day, but hopefully also creating some connections to history, as Paula already introduced us to. So you may have heard that last week the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, published and presented a report titled "More Than a Human Can Bear: Israel's Systemic Use of Sexual, Reproductive and Other Forms of Gender-Based Violence" since October 2023. So the report includes many harrowing examples of deliberate attacks by the Israeli military, including on sexual and reproductive healthcare facilities. And I'd like to pick out one of these described in the report by the Commission of Inquiry, namely the Al Basma IVF clinic, Gaza's largest fertility clinic, which was shelled in December 2023, reportedly destroying around 4,000 embryos, as well as 1,000 sperm samples and unfertilized eggs. All the reproductive material stored in the laboratory were destroyed, says the report, and it further states that they're not aware of any assisted reproductive services operational and available in Gaza as of January 2025. So this is, of course, only a snapshot of time and place, as our Warwick colleague Nicola Pratt and others state in a recent piece on why Palestine is a feminist issue, which is also, of course, the topic of today's discussion. For Palestinian women, Israel's colonization involves a cycle of displacement and violence that profoundly affects every dimension of life, including gender roles and family structures. So we might think here also of the deprivation of maternal care, shortage of feminine hygiene products, additional burdens of caregiving. This form of violence, which not only endangers women but also prevents the birth of future generations, has been referred to as reprocide. And I know Michelle has done some work on charting the different forms of genocide and the different forms of side that have occurred since the latest siege on Gaza. So that's defined as the deliberate strategy of targeting population reproduction. Although the report of the International Commission of Inquiry does not call it by this name, clearly the targeting of Gaza's IVF clinic falls under the category of reprocide. So I want to relate this example of reproductive violence against Palestinians to what I would like to refer to as international law's feminism of convenience, which really, we already heard the roots of that from Paula, namely a feminism that leaves structures of systemic violence against racialized women in place. This provokes us to ask questions about the ways in which gendered and racialized oppression are written into the international legal infrastructures. Building on that, we might ask how abolitionism in particular can help us understand the entanglement of international law with global capitalism through the convergence of a military and prison industrial complex in Gaza and Palestine more broadly. And here I draw on abolitionist geography as set out by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. How can abolitionism help us think of a decolonial, anti-racist and anti-capitalist future? So let's think about placemaking, because I believe it's important for international lawyers to think of placemaking through their discipline and then as placemaking as an act of liberation also from international law strictures. Thinking in terms of geography, architecture, infrastructure from a feminist perspective allows us to connect the genocide against the Palestinians with the military industrial complex, and also perhaps less intuitively with the prison industrial complex as well. So the military-industrial complex, as I'm sure you know, draws attention to the industry that supplies resources for military violence, highlighting those who profit from it. Of course, also universities in developing various weapons knowledge systems, and so on. And there are various ongoing demilitarization projects, including at Warwick. Feminist methodology shows the gendered aspects of war, like drawing attention to the hypermasculinity of its aggression as a form of conflict resolution. If we add sort of a Marxist perspective to that, it's not only possible to think of the productive and reproductive forces at play, but also to see the ways in which feminism itself has been co-opted in the service of capital and the military-industrial complex. So we might think here of the IDF showcasing its female combat soldiers as a reason that they are ostensibly the most moral army in the world. The path to abolitionist thinking and organizing is regularly via the prison industrial complex, though. And that's often sort of quite specifically rooted in the US context and US organizing. But Ruth Wilson Gilmore urges an expansive reading of the prison industrial complex, referencing the need to show the social organizing principles of race and labor. So here it's fruitful, I think, in an expansive reading to be reminded that before the siege of October 2023, Gaza was widely described as an open-air prison because of the 17-year blockade of Gaza. So if we think about that in terms of placemaking and what international law has to do with that, so the intersection of the military and prison industrial complexes brings to the fore questions of historical land allocation and dispossession, questions of race, as Stuart Hall said, as a modality through which political economic globalization is lived. And the question, which I always think is particularly powerful because it's quite simple, on profiteering. So on who participates in and benefits from the structural inequalities. Abolition geography materializes then into everyday spatial struggles, like the struggle over the future of the Al Basma IVF clinic that is now turned to rubble. So thinking about placemaking in international law, what happens if we turn our gaze to international law and how it materially changes places? With this view, we begin to see the historical placemaking of settler colonialism enabled and legitimized through international law, as we heard from Paula, from the mandate system to the Oslo Accords to today. This view connects these dynamics to other settler colonial histories, like European settlers in North America weaponizing reproductive health violence as a colonial strategy for land acquisition, expansion, and ethnic cleansing. The Genocide Convention, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, international human rights law, including their provisions for recognizing women's rights and crimes against women, are shown to be effective, or generally gender, are shown to be effective only in places that align with or do not disrupt imperialism. The institutions that were allegedly put in place to prevent genocide, unnecessary suffering, occupation, impunity, and annexation have proven to be powerless to protect the oppressed in the face of the force of settler colonialism. Or more accurately, through decisive inaction, institutions of international law are discredited as always having been complicit in the suffering of those racialized. So I think it's not productive to do sort of a rewriting of the history of international law here, rather than to think about the continuities. I'm sure everyone in this virtual room will agree with that anyway. This complicity is evident in the way international lawyers grapple with whether the widespread killing of Palestinians has reached the legal threshold of genocide in the sense of the Genocide Convention, for example. International lawyers claim that this high threshold is necessary to give expression to the seriousness and rarity of the crime. The ICJ, which safeguards and cultivates the idea of genocide as the crime of crimes, is following its previous self-restraint here, reaffirming the high threshold for intent. Alonso Gormidi argues forcefully that given the colonial origins of international law, genocide has by international lawyers been robbed of its potential to address the recurring crime of a colonial society carrying out the destruction of another. The same, I think, can also be said of the right to self-determination.
We might then also look towards international humanitarian law and international criminal law, and the continuities and consistencies rather than the exceptionality of the current genocide. And we might look to how these disciplines institutionally and normatively have been set up to make racialized differences. So that's not only due to their shared colonial history with international law as sort of subdisciplines of international law, but also due to their flourishing in and through global capitalism. Feminism has not done enough then, so it's important here to recall that gender relations, reproductive rights, domestic and sexual violence, property questions and workplace equality were all until the 1990s outside of the scope of international law, although also with a longer history. These issues and causes had multiple layers of exclusion. However, the 1990s normative and institution building project of Western feminism remained largely in a relationship of convenience with larger structures of oppression. This selective support reveals then a brand of feminism that, while vocal on certain issues of violence, remains silent or even complicit in others, particularly when the perpetrators are Western aligned powers. So as Afaf Jabiri notes in the piece on why Palestine is a feminist issue, the ethos of human rights, equality and democracy as celebrated in many Western feminist movements has been constructed on the exclusion and erasure of Palestinian lives. And we had a version of that already from Paula. By only committed to a feminism of convenience, international law remains a place that excludes and erases Palestinian lives. And so to close then, is feminism still needed? So yes, a radical feminism that embraces an expansive idea of abolitionism, busting those boundaries set by the feminism of convenience is needed. Rather than thinking sort of in abstract notions, I do think it's useful here to think with Gilmore in terms of placemaking and in terms of what she refers to as freedom is a place. So a truly decolonial, anti-racist and anti-capitalist struggle means the abolition of this open-air prison, undoing the international laws that support the nexus between the prison and military industrial complex. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. It is really very insightful. Thank you a lot. Michelle, we will move on to you now then. Your question is, how do international law and institutions reinforce or challenge cultural logics within the international legal system, especially considering the unique political and legal landscape of the Palestinian situation?
Thank you so much, Aysel and Paula, for this lovely invitation, and very much my talk builds on Christina's and Paula's. I'll try to be brief. So I think I'm starting this from, the point that we're all familiar with, which is that international law is always presented as weak, always, weaker than domestic law, and especially in this moment, weak in the face of the bulldozing that we see of all of these supposed rule of law norms and institutions in the last few months. And so I think the counter to that is to then invoke its hard edge through carceralism, and particularly through international criminal law and international human rights law. And so we see that in terms of the way that we have all these vague norms floating around in relation to international humanitarian law, but they have their hard edge in Article 147 of the Geneva Conventions. That there are these requirements on states to investigate or punish, through their carceral, properties, the most serious violations of international law under IHL. And we also see it obviously in terms of international criminal law. So in some ways, I think the move to international criminal law in the last few decades has been partly this need to respond to these accusations of, international law weakness, that somehow international criminal law can do something more. And I mean, I think we've seen this even in the last few days in terms of Duterte's arrest and imprisonment. This is like classic carceralism. And the immediate response is, wow, this is amazing. We've got this big baddie, in jail, and then we can sort of then launch all of the carceral responses required. And so I think then it's sort of quite captivating to sort of get on this bandwagon of responding in this carceral frame. And at that point, I think we need as critical scholars to ask ourselves, well, actually, how else might we do this? Even if we are not supportive of the practices that will be coming under the microscope in terms of what happened in the Philippines with the war on drugs, how else may we try to think about what forms of redress, okay? The problem is, though, once this carceral system has been invoked, as many scholars have pointed out, it's very hard to critique the ICC at that point, because in this moment the ICC is presenting itself as capable, as able, as getting the bad guy. And so to then counter carceralism, how can we do that in an effective way while still acknowledging the need for redress, the need for responsibility? And I think the same is true very much in terms of Palestine. How can we at this moment try to acknowledge, if possible, the sheer scale of harm and the need for some type of responsibility, while potentially trying to do it in a not only a non-carceral response, but in a really very, very strongly anti-carceral response, which is a little bit like as to how Christina was trying to talk about in terms of abolition. So I think Palestine is just a fantastic example then to think about how international law in general, but IHL and ICL in particular, have been far too fixated on these sort of carceral responses and how else to think about it. So firstly, in terms of Palestine and international humanitarian law, I see international humanitarian law for Palestine very much as a double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, we supposedly have some positive dimensions that Palestinians, lawyers for decades have tried to really harness for the Palestinian struggle. There are so many, specific legal norms that we can point to, largely through IHL, that we can then obviously say that Israel has violated. But I think really what that has shown is the fact that IHL and this fixation on specific provisions of the law then often tends to obscure the bigger pictures around the key issues of Palestinian struggle. And this really came out with the ICJ advisory opinion last year. Luckily, it just threw away, I think, all of those minute details about which specific element of the Fourth Geneva Convention has been violated. We all know that for decades has been going on. But if we fixate on those dimensions, I think we lose sight of the bigger questions, which have to be about the political, or if we want to put it in the legal frame, about self-determination. But I think even if we inhabit the IHL space for just a moment, we can see, in fact, how, again, international humanitarian law has enabled, partly, I would say, Israel's control over the territory, in that IHL enables the belligerent occupier to do various things in a carceral manner. And it then takes so much work to make those legal claims about the illegality of these particular carceral movements, that then you've almost just run out of time or energy to ask the bigger questions. So I think sort of getting stuck in that IHL loop, I think, has done a huge amount of damage to asking the broader questions. And I think as well, if we're operating in the sort of IHL carceral framework, we sort of see the territory very much as the occupied territories, as the West Bank, maybe East Jerusalem, and as the Gaza Strip, whereas actually perhaps it's much better to think of it as one territory with various iterations of carceral logics that apply maybe differently depending on where you're situated, which particular rights or non-rights you have, but still is being administered by one carceral system. And this has been particularly the case since the early 2000s, where increasingly Israel has actually tried to extend its civilian prison control over the entire population, and so thereby collapsing the distinction between the occupied territories and Israel proper. So in that sense, I just think it's useful to think about Israel as a generalized carceral state, and to sort of try to potentially work beyond, I think, the really narrow framing that IHL provides us. I think a second example is obviously, as you know, as probably the quintessential example here would be the ICC arrest warrants against Gallant and Netanyahu. And again, at this point, what do we do with these arrest warrants? Do we get excited? Because again, this is international law showing how responsive it is, how powerful it is. You know, do we embrace these carceral logics? I mean, obviously what's happening here is partly that we're having a radical individuation of responsibility here. We also have a radical limiting or confinement of the particular types of sheer horrors that have been inflicted on Palestinians. And so do we at this moment then say, oh yes, but we should do this? We should add this crime and this crime and this crime and this crime, because we only have 4 at the moment. And so I think then we do end up potentially getting to this sort of like chain of carceral, you know, invocation. You know, we've got these crimes listed, but let's have more. You know, it becomes quite intoxicating once that Pandora's box of criminalization is opened up. And I think, though, maybe we need to sort of ask ourselves, is that the path we want to tread on? Is that the approach that is best? And I think ultimately, obviously, it's not up to me. It's probably not up to any of us necessarily ourselves. We have to ask all Palestinians how they would respond. But in thinking about the ICC would be incapable of asking all Palestinians what they want, because the ICC itself has decided to frame Palestine very much as only those occupied territories. So questions of responsibility would only be situated in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and occupied East Jerusalem. So there would be no way really of trying to capture what modes of redress Palestinians themselves would want. But I suppose the basic question here is, can actually the ICC be capable of bringing liberation for Palestine? And that's an open question, and I can't possibly answer it. So I just want to finish then with the example, the awful example of Mahmoud Khalil, who was arrested on the 8th of March. And I think this really beautifully, unfortunately, illustrates some of these logics of carceralism and how to think beyond it. So in some ways, I think it really brings Palestine and the US together, you know, him being situated in the US during his arrest, but very much for activity related to Palestinian liberation. The US itself has been the most extreme site really of studies around carceralism, but also abolitionism. And so I think, you know, we might try to imagine, once I hope he is released, how would he want to respond? I mean, I think the thing is, when someone suffers a wrong, our first reaction is often to invoke carceral responses. And I think we see that with the ICC arrest warrants. But in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, would our response again be, should we just invoke, you know, that the US has violated XYZ provision of a human rights treaty? Should we try to sort of go down the path of habeas corpus claims domestically? Should we try to put certain officials behind bars for their, you know, abuse of power? Are these the types of logics we should respond to through this, you know, obviously horrific use of carceralism? Or are there other ways of imagining redress and modes of responsibility? And obviously, as Christina's already mentioned, I mean, this then gets to the broader question of abolitionism, which is not solely about, you know, getting rid of prisons. It's about trying to sort of remake social relations in general. So even if we think of the fact that apparently now, which is just absolutely shocking, 1 million Palestinians have been imprisoned since 1967, amounting to 40% of the male population, that doesn't mean solely that it's the male population that has been imprisoned. I think, again, like, we need to see that, in fact, incarceration or these carceral logics affects the entire population in very different ways. So if women, for example, are left without husbands at home or fathers at home, you'd have to trace through all of the types of violence that they are then witness to themselves. So I'm just sort of trying to say that a broader carceral frame, anti-carceral abolitionist frame, would ask us to think more broadly about that. And so I think ultimately I'm trying to say that the carceral logics of international criminal law, I don't think will work for Palestine, I think, but obviously ultimately it's up to Palestinians to make that determination. I do think that perhaps international law's greatest power is not its pastoral logic, but its ability to frame and to condemn. So I think the linguistic power it has been extremely powerful, even to today. And that's why the debates around genocide and its application have actually been so fraught, because actually we all can acknowledge how powerful words are. And so it's our responsibility then to use words in creative and forceful ways, rather than simply call for, more people to be imprisoned or more people to be put on trial. That's what I would say where some of international law's power can really lie. But ultimately, the most important thing is to give those people who have been affected by carceral logics, in this case Palestinians, the chance to make their own futures. Yeah, thank you.
Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. It was very interesting. Sorry, it's so interesting that I really forgot about timings when Paola was, and Christine and Michelle. Sorry, I'm really sorry. I forgot about timing. And Nahed, just floor is yours now, and I will just ask you to not forget about timing. So the question is for you: is Palestine a feminist issue? Do the intersection of international law, gender, and the color line in Palestine challenge Eurocentric narratives? How might this reshape our understanding of feminist legal theory and praxis? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation to joining you and others here in this debate. And so maybe the first part of answering this question is by saying that there are obviously many types of feminisms out there, right? And the feminisms are also evolving, just as our understanding of genocide or international law is also evolving. So one of them obviously is colonial feminism, referencing Western and colonial discourses and policies that deploy the language of liberating women to justify invasions, justifying genocides, military occupations, or resource extractions, particularly land and labor exploitations. And colonial feminism depicts Palestinian women as helpless victims in need of saving from Hamas, or I guess I should say Hamas, right, which is the Hebrew pronunciation of Hamas. So saving them from their own Palestinian culture, their society, and their religion, and while simultaneously rendering them disposable and threatening and deserving of death, them together with their children and their families and their brothers and sons and fathers and husbands. So these tactics collude to justify like an ongoing Zionist expansion and occupation of Palestinian land and expulsion of people, and endless military violence inflicted on Palestinian life. And here a new term, I guess a new term kind of comes in, which is reproductive genocide. It becomes relevant as it refers to the policies. We could actually think about reproductive genocide, but I was actually thinking of maybe this is liberal genocide, right? We have to talk about the liberalism that comes with feminism, and the liberalism right now that's also reflected in international law, and the liberalism that is also reflected in the entire intention part of our understanding of genocide. So in a way, so ideally, if I had more time, I would try to kind of connect the feminism, the law, and the genocide part in its kind of structural elements. And one of them is liberalism, I think. But focusing on reproductive genocide for a moment is obviously referring to a row of like policies, discourses, and practices that delimit and target life chances of communities, making them vulnerable by systematic military violence and occupation, besiegement, settler colonialism, and imperial warfare. And it includes like a wide range of measures from mass incarceration, psychological warfare, collective punishment, ethnic cleansing, and gendered and sexual violence of women and girls, but also men and boys, as I will be talking about in a minute, by the occupying state of force. And by and large, it includes the devaluation of life through public dehumanization and calls for genocide. And the dehumanization of language, we've been witnessing that for over 75 years, the project of Palestinian dispossession. And I kind of want to sneak in here So while Christina was talking about the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex, I want to sneak in here the academic-military complex, right? The way we've been also, engaging, and Michelle said it also, engaging with international humanitarian law, engaging, with some kind of feminist approaches to international law, but, allowing kind of for our field to kind of, gloss over the dehumanization we've been seeing for quite some time. Through kind of uncritical use of such discourse, I guess it becomes possible a reproductive genocide that we're seeing right now. And in that sense, it's actually history repeating itself in Gaza. And this is why a critical feminism that takes Palestine into consideration, includes it and makes it kind of centerpiece almost, does take history of the marginalized into consideration. And in obviously in the context of Gaza, reproductive genocide then includes large structural questions, cutting people off from vital life-saving sources such as water, fuel, electricity, food, the denial of life-giving and life-saving medical resources. So we cannot think about the reproductive genocide without large structural kind of resource questions here in place. And it is the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, in its just recently 3 days ago released report called More Than a Human Can Bear, Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence since October 7th, that Christine already mentioned. And they say that what that we're witnessing a high and increasing number and proportion of female fatalities in Gaza, which is on an unprecedented scale. Right. So, of course, when a report like this, kind of framed in liberal, boring, technical legal language, uses the terms of unprecedented scale, right, you would assume that all feminists, regardless of what kind of brand of feminism they call themselves of, would rise, and say, okay, this seems to be kind of a shift, right? Whatever we thought before that report, now I guess this is our time to come to the fore. And it's in Section 218 that the Commission says that it finds that the Israeli authorities have destroyed in part the reproductive capacity of the Palestinians in Gaza as a group, including by imposing measures intended to prevent birth, one of the categories of genocidal acts in the Rome Statute and the Genocide Convention. Again, you would assume everyone dealing with genocide, if they have not voiced their criticism so far, coming to the fore, the kind of the feminists, the liberals, the kind of lefty, or even those, dealing with kind of longue durée of kind of colonial violence would come to the fore. And here we see that, and this is, I guess, also the paper that Christine mentioned by Nicola Pratt, seeing that many of our colleagues still have chosen to remain silent, right, in the face of all this material produced. And so it sounds almost like, what does it sound like? A call to apply a gender-conscious approach to genocide is still something we're not seeing. We're not seeing feminists engaging with genocide, right? And then second point I would like to make is that we're also not seeing feminists engaging with gender and sexual violence as indispensable to settler colonialism, right? Still not connecting the two to each other, because settler colonialism has this, the logic of elimination, the indigenous peoples, stealing their lands, repressing their resistance. And here comes the demographic anxiety into the play, right? Constructing Palestinian women's bodies and their sexualities and reproductive capacities as a security threat, right? I mean, we have Israeli universities that used to teach courses on the demographic threat, right? Again, we didn't hear much of our feminist or critical legal scholar colleagues, right, raising the alarm clocks, the alarm bells. And so we actually also obviously know that Palestinian men and boys also are increasingly subject to sexual violence in Israeli prison systems, which in fact are Israeli torture systems, right? So again, it seems like we have not made explicit enough some connections, right, between genocide and the reproductive rights, between prisons and torture within the international kind of legal, critical kind of understanding. And here actually what we've seen recently is really, parts of the Israeli public defending a right to rape, so it's like a total reframing of how reframing, right? So the right to rape was actually really kind of shouted out loud, and reports, especially when reports emerged from the torture and reports, rape reports from the military base Stade d'Etaiman, where people went to defend the right of the soldiers and reservists to rape Palestinian men. And so a third thing becomes visible here, which is a kind of emerging fascist feminism is becoming increasingly visible, weaponizing the fear for more surveillance, calling for more surveillance, more state violence, more police or university repression, and supporting or at least not resisting anti-immigration measures, right? And so crucially, then advocating for carceral anti-Semitism. And I'm bringing in the carceral anti-Semitism because, of course, most of us are familiar with the carceral feminism, right? That found some criticism. And the carceral turn in the fight against anti-Semitism echoes some of the developments of carceral feminism, a concept that is used in abolitionist thought and practice to critique the alignment of feminist movements with the state and with its criminal legal system, and now its alignment with genocidal policies and genocidal languages. So against the background of more general shift away from social justice frameworks, so there's a shift of feminism kind of turning away from that to some extent towards state control and punishment, increasingly calling for punishment of gendered and sexual violence, but by embracing the neoliberal carceral state, and in the case of Israel, embracing the neoliberal genocidal state. Now, a fourth issue here is the liberal feminism, right? And here, liberal feminism, especially as embedded in Western institutions, and I think the institutional corset here becomes very relevant, right? So I'm not necessarily talking about, there's this tension about individuals and institutions, but I think the institutions are very crucial here in upholding certain narratives and in demanding, or at least not pushing back against certain carceral and repressive and liberal, and if you want, fascist slash kind of a liberal fascism here, right? And so they work with the claims of neutrality and objectivity and a balanced approach, as we're witnessing genocide of Palestinians and a state-led surge in racist attacks, harassment, and repression against Palestinians and Arab and Muslim communities in the diaspora, and pretty much even beyond that, right? It's solidarity communities which in an interesting way are transforming kind of almost beyond race and beyond identity, right? Which is also kind of an interesting thing to see, right? That the solidarity movement is much bigger than just racialized communities. Now, liberal feminism has responded to the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza with statements that are tacitly and explicitly complicit with genocide. So we need to talk more about the concept of complicity here through deflection tactics, both covert and overt ones, from bureaucratic measures meant to stall and shut down discussions on Palestine to avert punishments, especially vis-a-vis student organizations, and engaging pretty much themselves in technologies of erasure by refusing to name Palestine or Palestinians or anti-Palestinian racism or the genocide, obviously, in Gaza, and connecting that to settler colonial violence and military occupation. And what we've seen also is that liberal feminism engages in the weaponization of safety and other feminist and liberatory ideals on university campuses and beyond. And instead of calling out Zionist, racist, and white supremacist weaponization of safety and fear, it's a guise for silencing, repressing, and erasing, again, Palestinian and other critical voices. And it's Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, a Palestinian scholar at Hebrew University, arrested and taken into Israeli custody for scholarly writing, who states that when colonizers talk about security, they are in fact talking about violence. So as an international legal scholar, I'd also say when Israelis talk about self-defense, they are in fact talking about genocide, right? So coupled with this weaponization of anti-Semitism, this colonial Eurocentric concept of safety has been used to silence pro-Palestinian speech in the service of the comfort of Zionism. And this repression will not obviously keep any of us safe. One of the collective anti-Zionist Jewish organizations has asserted, quote, investment in state violence is not indicative of care for Jewish lives. So again, the concepts of the Israel-centered concept of self-defense, or the decades-long engagement with merely with humanitarian law or occupation law, was in fact a cover-up, a camouflage, to not engage with deeper connections between violence, dispossession, and the denial of Palestinian right of self-determination. Now, when allegations of top-down commanded rape by Palestinians of Israeli women started circulating, critical feminists, those that were informed by global indigenous and eco-feminist and anti-racist thought, knew that allegations of sexual violence against racialized communities have been instrumental in propagating colonial violence and genocide and chattel slavery and racial subjugation and imperial warfare, and other forms of systematic violence on indigenous and racialized peoples worldwide. So feminists engaging with history and knowing how history informs law and having a kind of deeper understanding of the many dimensions of violence knew that there was something bigger going on here. Now, I want to refer to the 2021 Palestinian Feminist Collective, laying out why Palestinian liberation is a critical feminist issue. And of course, every time you mention a date before October 7th, 2023, it's when everyone realizes, okay, this started long before October 7th, right? We have to, of course, talk about historiography here, right? We have to talk about that reception of this Palestinian feminist collective. You know, why was it? So, you know, it's putting to the fore like an intersectional decolonial feminist vision in Palestine and beyond. And it is focusing on social and political liberation by way of confronting systematic gendered and colonial violence, oppression, and dispossession. And it was signed by many Black, Indigenous, queer, and third world scholars and activists that understood how Zionist settler colonial dispossession, occupation, and regulation control Palestinian bodies, but that they were rooted also in a kind of masculinist militarism, although I think it would also fair to say, with respect to Israeli army, feminist militarism, right? So we have different forms of, again, you know, feminisms here clashing all the time, you know. And of course, a question would be, you know, why or how was the 2021 Palestinian Feminist Collective received in international legal circles, for instance, or why was it not received, right? Why do I have to go back to like a pledge almost now 4 years old that's already laid out so much, you know? And we have to think a bit more also about the kind of academic industrial complex here, right? That many of us through our institutions are part of. Now, the pledge reads, quote, Zionist violence continues to dominate Palestinian lives in intimate ways. Throughout the homeland, Israel demolishes Palestinian homes, subjugates Palestinian prisoners of conscience to systematic sexual and physical abuse and torture, and polices Palestinian bodies, sexualities, reproductive rights, and family life. So this could be from now, right? I mean, so why are we, so I'm sorry, I'm looking forward that it, you know, obviously you know what this is about. This is not about the politics of speaking, the politics of listening, you know, and even within feminist circles, right? So there is still kind of ongoing exclusion happening in feminist circles. So I think, I mean, I definitely have to end on a positive note. I just want to say in a way that while we have many feminisms clashing, just as we have many international legal understandings clashing at this time, and we have many kind of understandings of genocides evolving, you know, from genocide to ecocide, to domicide, to scholasticide, you know, all of this also is coming up to the fore. I do think that thinking about the catastrophe as a chance, as an opportunity, Palestine is an opportunity for feminism, right? So it is like a way to, you know, depart from anything called feminist militarism, colonial feminism, fascist feminism, liberal feminism, right? It seems like, you know, Palestine is a chance to say what feminism just cannot be, you know, and this would be at least, you know, a kind of productive way to think about the catastrophe that we're witnessing right now. Thank you.
Thinking ahead, it was very interesting listening to you, and especially valuable because from your own subjective perspective, considering your background. So thank you a lot for being here with us today.